Life is a moderately good play with a badly written third act. That line from Truman Capote might sound whimsical at first, but in many ways it hints at the layers of drama that defined his entire existence. Imagine someone so unapologetically themselves. High-pitched voice, flamboyant mannerisms, a tiny stature offset by an oversized personality, that he could stroll confidently among the glittering lights of Studio 54 in the late 1970s, brush elbows with the Rolling Stones, gossip about iconic Hollywood stars, and still be revered as a literary genius. That was Capote, a man whose public persona was often as captivating as the works he produced. He was born in New Orleans in 1924, the city itself famous for its mystic jazz clubs and languid Mississippi nights, seemed like a perfect metaphor for the swirl of complexities that would color Capote's life. At the time of his birth, his mother, Lily Mae Falk, was only 17, and his father, Archelaus Persons, was struggling financially, so the household wasn't exactly stable. Even though the family lacked monetary resources, that financial fragility paled in comparison to the emotional turbulence that would characterize his early years. Imagine the sights and sounds of a place like Depression-era New Orleans. The haunting notes of a trumpet drifting through a humid night, the camaraderie of speakeasies, hidden behind wooden doors, and a sense that anything could happen under those swaying street lamps. Capote came into the world amidst this mix of romance and hardship, a perfect stage for someone fated to dwell as much in fantasy as in reality. He was originally called Truman Streckfus Persons, an unwieldy name he later found too clunky for the refined image he envisioned for himself. He adopted Capote from his stepfather's surname because it oozed a certain elegance. Perhaps it was the first sign of his flair for dramatics, a flair that would expand into every aspect of his public image. The impetus to change one's name often reflects a desire to craft an identity, to be in full control of how the world perceives you. In Capote's case, choosing that new name was more than a mere vanity move. It was an early demonstration of his knack for storytelling, for shaping narratives even if it meant rewriting his own personal story. Capote would become inseparable from his flamboyant presence, and once the literary world started catching on, it was that name they would champion, and sometimes revile. By his own account, Capote had already started writing seriously by age 11, devoting a few hours each day after school to polish his craft. It's easy to picture a small boy, perched at a rickety desk, scribbling words by lamplight in a quiet house, while other kids might have been outside playing baseball or chasing each other around the neighborhood. Did he know he would someday rub elbows with Hollywood's elite, frequent, star-studded parties and spark controversies that would echo through the halls of American literature? Probably not. But the simple devotion of a child writer determined to put words on paper, day after day, year after year, laid the groundwork for a future that would be anything but ordinary. During his childhood in Alabama, Capote befriended Harper Lee, another budding writer who would one day give the world To Kill a Mockingbird. Their childhood camaraderie served as an incubator for creativity. They exchanged stories, jokes, and perhaps mild gossip, practices Capote would eventually elevate to an art form. Lee would later use Capote as the inspiration for the imaginative Dill Harris in her classic novel. The seeds they planted in their small Alabama community grew into two drastically different but equally seismic literary careers. One of them would remain famously private, dodging publicity for decades, while the other, Capote, would plunge headfirst into the limelight, embracing attention and stirring up the sort of gossip that sold newspapers and fueled talk shows. Yet for all his youthful brilliance and eventual success, Capote's early professional stints were something of a roller coaster. In his teens, he snagged a job at the New Yorker as a copy boy, no small feat for someone that young. You might think he'd be on cloud nine, strutting around that legendary magazine's corridors with stars in his eyes. Instead, his brash attitude clashed with none other than poet Robert Frost. The ensuing tension got him fired, an inauspicious end to his first big break in the magazine world. However, Capote rarely let such setbacks deter him. He was too enthralled with the idea of forging a legend to let one firing define him. The next stepping stone came in the form of a gig at Mademoiselle magazine, where Capote exercised his keen editorial eye. He stumbled upon a short story titled Homecoming, written by a then unknown author, Ray Bradbury. We could consider that moment as a tiny hinge on which a great door in literary history would swing. Capote, impressed with Bradbury's prose, insisted that Mademoiselle publish it, a decision that effectively launched Bradbury's career. If there's any doubt about Capote's talent for spotting brilliance beyond his own writing, that single instance dispels it. It wasn't all professional hustling, though. Capote found time for romantic entanglements. One of his first significant relationships was with Newton Arvin, a literature professor. Their bond was not only personal but also intellectual, shaping Capote's worldview. For a gay couple in that era, living openly was an act of courage. One can only imagine the hushed whispers, the concealed glances, and the threat of social or even physical harm. But Capote, so flamboyant and unafraid, refused to cower. The relationship eventually ended, but it left its stamp on his soul. And even on the dedication page of his novel, Other Voices, Other Rooms. In the early 1940s, Capote started garnering attention for short stories like Miriam, published in well-known magazines. That success laid the groundwork for his transition into full-length works. He was no one-trick pony, though. Soon after, he took a stab at screenwriting. His first significant project in that arena was Beat the Devil, a quirky film directed by John Huston. Legend has it that Capote wrote the screenplay a few days at a time, only just staying ahead of shooting. In an iconic moment on set, Capote arm wrestled Humphrey Bogart and won. If that doesn't encapsulate his paradoxical mix of fragile appearance and formidable spirit, not much else could. Capote also co-adapted Henry James's The Turn of the Screw into the 1961 horror film The Innocents. By this point, he had proven he could navigate magazines, short stories, novels, and even Hollywood's labyrinthine creative processes. But the real turning point, the moment that would catapult his name into the broader cultural consciousness, was still on the horizon. In 1958, he published the novella Breakfast at Tiffany's, introducing the world to the unforgettable Holly Golightly. The metamorphosis of her name alone, from Connie Gustafson to Holiday Golightly to Holly Golightly, epitomizes Capote's flair for style and branding. Holly became a cultural icon, the carefree, charming ingenue with big sunglasses, pearls, and the desire for something more than she had. When the time came to adapt Breakfast at Tiffany's to film, Capote had his heart set on Marilyn Monroe for the role of Holly. It's a casting choice that, in an alternate universe, would have changed cinematic history. However, the studio insisted on Audrey Hepburn. Her portrayal is now legendary, but it infuriated Capote, who felt that Hepburn, for all her grace and ethereal charm, was miscast. He wanted the raw, unpolished energy that Monroe might have brought to the role. The bitterness lingered. Capote once confessed that the adaptation made him want to throw up. Despite that, the film became a classic, and ironically, it only grew Capote's fame, even if it did so in a way that bristled against his original vision. Then came a moment that changed not just Capote's life, but also the American literary landscape. In November 1959, he stumbled upon a newspaper article detailing the gruesome murders of the Clutter family in Holcomb, Kansas. 4 members of the family were slaughtered in a crime that shocked the quiet Midwestern community. Fascinated and driven by a near-obsessive curiosity, Capote traveled to Kansas to investigate, bringing Harper Lee along as an informal research partner. The project they embarked on would eventually become In Cold Blood, a nonfiction novel that fused journalistic rigor with narrative storytelling. He spent 6 years locked in this project, meticulously interviewing locals, law enforcement officials, and most notably the murderers themselves, Perry Smith and Richard Hickok. In Cold Blood was published in 1966 to both critical acclaim and public fascination. It was an instant bestseller, creating a new template for the true crime genre, influencing everything from magazine reporting to documentary filmmaking. The Capote method of weaving facts with narrative flair drew admirers and critics in equal measure. Some claimed he fabricated scenes to amp up the drama. Others, including a Kansas Bureau of Investigation agent, insisted that at least one of the book's final scenes was invented. Jack Olson, another figure in true crime, accused Capote of excess dramatization. True or not, In Cold Blood shot Capote to the pinnacle of literary celebrity. It also drove a wedge between him and Harper Lee, who felt undercredited for her integral role in the research. Their friendship never fully recovered. While In Cold Blood brought fame and fortune, it also nearly destroyed Capote emotionally. Witnessing the confessions of 2 murderers, forging a sort of unsettling bond with them, and then attending their executions exacted a terrible toll on him. The research demanded a level of engagement with brutal violence that might shake even the steeliest nerves. Capote reportedly turned to substance abuse, alcohol and tranquilizers, to cope with the strain, and from this point on, his personal demons would overshadow much of what he tried to accomplish. Despite the explosion of public interest, he never again completed another major novel. For years, he teased a project called Answered Prayers, which would supposedly lift the curtain on high society secrets and scandalous affairs. Bits of it were published in Esquire, leading to scandalized hushes across the very socialite circles he'd once circulated in. Friends turned against him, outraged that their private lives might become fodder for Capote's next big nonfiction novel. The unsubtle betrayal in those excerpts effectively excommunicated him from certain dinner party guest lists. Although Capote craved attention, losing the favor of the high society crowd hurt him more than he might have ever admitted. He left Answered Prayers unfinished, and it remains one of the most famous incomplete works of American literature. By the 1970s, you could often find Capote at Studio 54, mingling with celebrities under strobe lights, dancing, maybe sipping a drink, laced with the usual swirl of nightlife temptations. He was a living contradiction. On one hand, hobnobbing in the glitziest of places. On the other, sinking deeper into personal vices that made his life precarious. Somewhere along the line, he became infamous as a gossip monger, whispering about closeted stars or government figures like J. Edgar Hoover. Capote spread the rumor that Hoover was a secret cross-dresser. In an era before social media, the rumor mill functioned largely by word of mouth, and Capote's mouth was as busy as they came. He thrived on the scandalous, the sensational, the salacious. His flamboyant public persona sometimes made cameo appearances, literally. In Woody Allen's Annie Hall, there is a comedic aside about someone winning a Truman Capote lookalike contest, at which point Capote himself appears on camera in a blink and you'll miss it moment. It was a meta joke, the kind of wink at the audience that both recognized Capote's ubiquity and his willingness to poke fun at his own image. Those who caught it realized they were watching a man who loved being in on the joke, especially if the joke was about him. But superstition quietly gnawed at him behind all the glitz and laughter. For instance, Capote refused to begin or end any writing project on a Friday, nor would he stay in a hotel room numbered 13. These compulsions were as much a part of him as his signature voice or distinctive physical gestures. Superstition gave him a semblance of control in a world that felt, at times, harsh and unpredictable. It also might have been a relic of his Southern upbringing, where folklore and taboo often run deep, shaping worldviews in subtle ways. Amidst his numerous affairs, the one lasting constant in his personal life was Jack Dunphy, a writer who was essentially Capote's lifelong partner. They maintained something of a unique arrangement, spending long stretches apart yet remaining deeply bonded. Perhaps that was the only way to sustain a relationship with someone so mercurial and unpredictable. When Capote died in 1984, Dunphy survived him by 8 years, and their ashes were eventually scattered together at Long Pond Greenbelt, bringing a final sense of unity to a relationship that might have often been overshadowed by Capote's public persona. That flamboyant exterior was often a shield, masking insecurities and emotional wounds. While Capote soared high on success, he also plunged into depressions and substance abuse. Friends and colleagues noticed that after the mania of In Cold Blood, something in him appeared broken, or at least irreparably bent. He tried to keep working. He was even hired by Rolling Stone magazine to follow the Rolling Stones on tour, but he gave up partway through, reportedly bored by the band's routine. It was a telling sign. The man who could find interest in the darkest corners of humanity and shape them into a literary phenomenon was suddenly uninterested in the biggest rock band on the planet. That disillusionment spoke volumes about where Capote was emotionally and creatively in that phase of his life. By the time he made that cameo in Annie Hall, he was a cultural reference point. Everyone recognized him, but more for his flamboyance than for his writing. The shift from literary prodigy to celebrity figure might have felt like a betrayal of his original aspirations. Or perhaps it was exactly what he'd courted all along: fame, attention, the chance to be a household name. For better or worse, Truman Capote had become a brand. Yet that brand was showing signs of wear and tear as rumors circulated of his erratic behavior and missed deadlines, fueled by ongoing dependencies that kept him from harnessing the creative lightning he once channeled so effectively. There's also the complicated matter of how he blended fact and fiction. In Cold Blood is the classic example, lauded as a true crime masterpiece, but with persistent accusations that certain dialogues or scenes might have been conjured up to pack more punch. Capote insisted he was merely capturing the essence of events. But critics pointed out that the non-fiction novel label granted him creative license, and sometimes that license might lead to bending the truth. The moral debate over whether he was crossing lines of journalistic integrity continues to loom over the genre he helped popularize. Ironically, the literary superstar status he gained from that work also hinged on the sense of authenticity it projected, so the notion that he might have embroidered events unsettled many. Even so, the significance of In Cold Blood can't be overstated. It paved the way for a century of true crime fascination, from investigative podcasts to Netflix docuseries. People consume that genre voraciously, and Capote's influence is present in each new iteration. As for the real-life events behind In Cold Blood, it's worth reflecting on how intimately Capote became acquainted with Perry Smith and Richard Hickok. He spent hours upon hours interviewing them in their cells, he formed a bizarre kinship with Perry Smith, rumored by some to be deeper than mere journalistic interest. Attending their executions and seeing them walk that final path scarred Capote. He confessed that had he known how much anguish the project would cause him, he would have stayed far away from Holcomb, Kansas. Such regrets, if anything, emphasize his deeply human side beneath the celebrity glimmer. When the book soared to success, it came at a personal price. The sense of betrayal Harper Lee felt, the moral questions about fictionalizing real tragedy, and the emotional trauma Capote himself endured, they all built up until writing another major work seemed almost impossible. And indeed it was. Not that he ever gave up being Truman Capote, the legendary bon vivant and occasional troublemaker. He continued to drop tantalizing hints of grand literary comebacks, but those comebacks never quite manifested. In the swirl of high society events, he'd slip rumors to whichever reporter was listening, like the one about J. Edgar Hoover wearing dresses. Whether he believed such rumors or simply enjoyed the scandal they generated remains open to speculation. Often, it seemed Capote just relished stirring the pot to see how the world would react. He confided in those around him that he sometimes sympathized with countercultural movements, even if he appeared to belong to a more elite social stratum. His nights at Studio 54 placed him in a vortex of bohemian creativity, the disco world where lines blurred between artists, socialites, and everyday partygoers. At the same time, he might attend a black tie fundraiser the next evening, trading witty barbs with people whose secrets he was quietly stashing for potential stories. In many ways, he was a cultural chameleon, able to mingle with wildly different crowds without losing his sense of self. Or perhaps it's more accurate to say he had multiple selves, each one adapted for a different social situation. By the early 1980s, Capote's health was in serious decline. Years of drinking and drug use, combined with a life of emotional turbulence, had taken their toll. He had attempted rehab more than once, but the cycles of relapse persisted. The flamboyant writer who once out-arm wrestled Humphrey Bogart was physically diminished. On August 25, 1984, Truman Capote passed away at the home of his friend Joanne Carson. The official cause, liver disease, complicated by phlebitis and multiple drug intoxication. He was 59, young by modern standards, but perhaps an inevitability given the pace and depth of the life he had led. Many lamented the years he'd lost to addiction, wondering how many more stories or novels he might have produced had he been able to steer clear of those pitfalls. After his death, Capote's reputation occasionally dipped into a lull. People remembered the gossip, the unfinished works, the controversies. But then, renewed interest would spring up, like in 2005 and 2006, when two films about his process creating In Cold Blood came out almost back-to-back. Capote, starring Philip Seymour Hoffman, and Infamous, starring Toby Jones. Those films reignited discussions about his fascinating mixture of charm and torment, his manipulative tendencies when it came to gleaning information from sources, and the ethical quandaries of forging a personal connection with convicted killers. He became once more a topic of cultural fascination, a tragic figure who soared too high on the wings of fame and crashed under the weight of expectation and personal demons. But Capote's influence has never really left. Periodically, new works or rediscovered pieces bring him back into the limelight. In 2013, a Swiss publisher uncovered 14 previously unknown short stories that Capote had written during his teenage years. Published in 2015, the early stories of Truman Capote reminded the world that he was first and foremost a writer of extraordinary gifts, someone who could make words dance on a page in ways that were at turns chilling, charming, and gut-wrenchingly honest. These newly found pieces provided a glimpse of that raw, unpolished gem of a writer before fame, addiction, and heartbreak took their toll. He once declared that all literature is gossip, a reflection of the secrets people often keep tucked away. If so, Capote spent his life chasing those secrets, sometimes capturing them with brilliant insight, other times spinning them into bigger spectacles. Whether you see him as a tragic figure undone by fame, a literary titan who redefined genres, or an eccentric gossip whose life was one long performance piece, you're tapping into the multifaceted enigma that was Truman Capote. And in the end, that might be his biggest legacy. A life so rich in contradictions that even his own quote about a badly written third act can't diminish the sheer influence and intrigue he left behind. His spirit remains in every boundary-pushing nonfiction novel, every Hollywood adaptation that dares to reimagine a literary character, and every gossip session about the private lives of the rich and famous. Truman Capote continues to cast a long, mischievous, and fascinating shadow over American culture, reminding us that the interplay between truth and invention can be both dazzling and dangerous, and that the act of storytelling, much like life, never truly ties up its loose ends in a neat little bow.